The morning of the 20th of December 1943 began like any other over-occupied Europe, cold, gray, and saturated with the quiet dread that precedes catastrophe. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was 21 years old. He had never flown a combat mission. That morning, he was handed his first. His B-17 bomber, christened Ye Old Pub, carried 10 men and 6,000 pounds of explosives toward a Focke-Wulf factory on the outskirts of Bremen, Germany. Intelligence had warned of heavy fighter resistance. What the briefing officers neglected to mention was the position they had assigned Brown's crew in the formation. The exposed outer edge, the slot veteran pilots called Purple Heart corner. German fighters always struck there first, probing the weakest point of the American defensive wall. New crews were routinely placed there. Brown's crew was the newest of all. Before Ye Old Pub reached its target, a cannon shell detonated directly in front of the cockpit. The nose disintegrated. At 27,000 feet, temperatures hovered at 60 below zero. Now the wind tore through the aircraft at over 150 miles per h. Our one engine died immediately. Another began overspeeding. The formation pulled ahead and vanished. Within seconds, Ye Old Pub was alone in the sky, and German fighters noticed immediately. What followed was a systematic destruction. Between 12 and 15 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs descended on the wounded bomber for more than 10 minutes. Engines were shredded, hydraulic lined, burst, the electrical system collapsed. The tail section was torn open by cannon fire, and the tail gunner, Hugh Eckenroe, was killed instantly. Most of the remaining crew suffered wounds. Brown himself caught a shell fragment in his shoulder. The extreme cold had frozen the oil in the defensive guns. Of 11 mounted machine guns, 3 remained functional. Then the oxygen ran out. At altitude, the human brain does not negotiate with thin air. It simply stops. Brown felt his vision collapse inward. His co-pilot had already lost consciousness beside him. His final coherent thought was that his crew would die on their very first mission. Ye Old Pub began to fall. The bomber plunged from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive airspeed, climbing past 300 miles per HR, the airframe shaking as though it might simply come apart. Then, at went, roughly 1,000 feet above the German countryside, something unexpected happened. The thicker air at low altitude contained enough oxygen to revive Brown. He came to, grabbed the controls, pulled with everything he had. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops, battered, bleeding, and flying directly over a Luftwaffe fighter airfield. On that airfield, a pilot named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt BF-109. Stigler was 28 years old and had flown nearly 500 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had buried his brother August, who died in 1940 when his aircraft went down over England. By December 1943, Stigler had 27 confirmed aerial victories. One more heavy bomber would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's most prestigious military honor. He looked up. He saw Ye Old Pub staggering across the sky at barely 100 feet. He climbed into his fighter and took off. Within minutes, Stigler had positioned himself behind the crippled B-17. His gun sight settled on the tail section. One trigger pull, that was all. But through the massive holes torn in the bomber's fuselage, Stigler saw something that made him lift his finger away. He saw the body of a young man slumped over a shattered gun. He saw blood frozen into red icicles on the turret wreckage. He saw wounded men dragging themselves across the floor trying to help their wounded crewmates. He saw a pilot and co-pilot fighting with trembling hands simply to keep the aircraft in the air. No one was fighting back. No one could. Stigler thought of his old commanding officer in North Africa, a man named Gustav R. Riedel, who had once gathered his pilots and told them plainly, shoot a man in a parachute, and I will shoot you myself. The principle was simple. A defenseless man was not a target. Killing him was not combat. These Americans were not in parachutes, but they might as well have been. Stigler made his decision. He pulled his fighter alongside the cockpit. Brown stared at him through the shattered window, eyes wide, certain he was about to die. Stigler raised his hand and pointed north toward Sweden. Neutral territory, safety. Brown didn't understand. He kept flying west toward England, 250 miles of freezing ocean between him and home. Stigler recognized that there was only one option left, and it carried the death penalty. He slid his Messerschmitt into tight formation on the B-17's left wing, so close their aircraft nearly touched. From the ground, the silhouettes would merge. Anti-aircraft gunners would see a German fighter and hold their fire. Radar stations would track two aircraft flying in formation and assume they were friendly. It was a desperate calculation, but it was the only one available. Mile after mile, Stigler flew beside the dying bomber over farmland, over villages, past coastal batteries and radar installations. At any moment, another German pilot could appear and ask why. Stigler was escorting an enemy aircraft rather than destroying it. The answer would mean a firing squad. He kept flying anyway. When Ye Old Pub crossed the coastline and headed out over the North Sea, Stigler knew he couldn't follow. His fuel was low. His radiator had been damaged earlier in the morning. England meant a prisoner of war camp. He had done what he could. He pulled alongside Brown's cockpit one final time. Their eyes met across a few feet of frozen air. Two young men from opposite nations in the middle of a war neither had chosen. Stigler raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Then he banked left and disappeared into the gray sky. Both men kept their silence for 46 years. Brown was ordered never to speak of it. Stigler couldn't speak of it without risking his life. Each man spent decades wondering whether the other had survived, whether the decision had mattered, and whether anyone would ever know. In 1990, Brown published a letter in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe veterans, describing the encounter and asking if anyone recognized the story. Weeks later, an envelope arrived with a Canadian postmark inside, 3 words. I was the one they met that summer in a Florida hotel lobby. 2 old men, 46 years of unanswered questions dissolving in a single embrace. Brown had brought photographs, his children, his grandchildren, 3 generations of a family that existed, because a German pilot had lifted his finger from a trigger in 1943. Stigler looked at those photographs for a long time. He had never received his Knight's Cross. Standing in that lobby, he understood he had received something no medal could represent. He signed every letter to Brown the same way for the rest of his life. Your brother Franz. Stigler died in March 2008, Brown followed 8 months later. They had spent 18 years as family phone calls every week, fishing trips, holidays, reunions where they stood side by side, told their story to audiences who wept openly. When it was over, they left behind a friendship that had outlasted the war, the hatred, and eventually time itself. One man had every reason to kill, the other had no way to survive, and somewhere above the treetops of northern Germany, one of them chose mercy and changed everything that came after Wundtent